Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, let's bring you a little bit more now on our top story, the pressure building on Theresa May to spend more on public services and scrap the public sector pay cap. Joining us from central London to discuss whether the country really can afford to ease up on austerity are Alex Wild, Research Director at the Taxpayers Alliance, and Fran Boyd, the Executive Director of the think tank Positive Money. Many thanks to both of you for being with us. Fran, to you first. I recall a time not that long ago where there was agreement on both sides of the House of Commons that tackling the deficit, tackling the debt had to be the priority. The difference of opinion was just the speed of change at which that deficit was tackled. Nowadays, you've got politicians who don't even mention the deficit and who instead are talking about borrowing to invest and to grow the economy. What's changed?
Well, obviously, the economy's got quite a lot worse since 2015, and I think that we can see the disappearance of deficit from the 27 election really shows that the deficit was a kind of made-up frame that was discussed by all parties, but actually wasn't really relevant to what's happening in our economy. Now we're seeing, 7 years after austerity, where the deficit has been the frame, we need to cut public spending, we're seeing wages falling, private debt is going up, and I think finally there's an acknowledgement if we carry on with this conversation, if we carry on with a economic outlook that doesn't make any sense, then it's going to run the UK economy into the ground. We've had high-level economists from all over the world, world-renowned economists saying austerity doesn't make sense, that there's no need for the politicians to be obsessed with cutting the deficit, and it finally seems like the Conservative government are waking up to the fact that this is nonsensical. It doesn't make sense as an economic plan, and they need to get rid of it.
Alex, let's put one of your points, Fran, directly to Alex Wild. The deficit, a made-up frame, not really relevant to our economy. I detect that you might not entirely agree with that.
Well, yeah, I disagree completely. I mean, the government currently spends a lot more than it brings in taxes and other revenue, and I agree it's been quite extraordinary, the turnaround, and the fact that no one seems to be really talking about this anymore, at least with politicians, and the reason is quite clearly the pretty terrible election result for the Conservative Party. But I mean, since 2010 the government's borrowed around £700 billion. I mean, how much more stimulus do you want? If you look at the amount that spending has been reduced in real terms, it's 0.2% lower than it was in 2010. The government is still spending about £28,500 for every single household in the country. That's only back to sort of 2007, 2008 levels, which was before the crisis. So the government's still spending enormous amounts of money, and far, far more than it raised in tax. And the big problem is that unless we sort this problem out now, it's going to get a lot worse in the future because we've got an ageing population. I mean, if you look at the Office for Budget Responsibility's long-term fiscal sustainability report, they project that the national debt's going to hit 234% of GDP in 2060, 2065 or so, which really would put us in the same league as countries like Greece at the moment. So it really is.
Alex, just sorry to interrupt, but you don't necessarily have to be anti-austerity to identify that some of the measures that were deployed in austerity's name were draconian, over the top, perhaps even ideologically driven, particularly when it comes to the welfare state.
Well, I don't particularly accept that it's ideologically driven, but there have been choices have been made which I wouldn't necessarily have made. And if you look at government spending, I mean, such a large proportion of government spending is welfare, health and debt interest, and once you add all that together you get to about 2/3 of government spending. And if you're not, there have been some cuts in welfare, but really only for working age, and they've been more than offset by increases in things like the triple lock for state pension, maintaining free bus passes, winter fuel payments, etc. And once you start ring fencing and increasing such large proportions of government spending, you're only left with a relatively small pool with which to try and get the deficit down with. And that's why we have seen some fairly significant cuts in non-protected budgets, things like policing. So it's a really lopsided approach to getting borrowing down. And I'm a bit worried that this word austerity has just become this sort of all-encompassing term for everything that's going bad, everything that's going wrong in the economy and society as a whole. I mean, let's be honest, austerity is getting the deficit down, right?
Let's just put that point to Fran, shall we? Fran, I suppose from your side of the argument, the problem is this, that borrowing to invest, borrowing even more money in an attempt to try and kickstart the economy, it is ultimately a gamble. And if it doesn't work, we're even more heavily indebted, the deficit is even bigger. I mean, there is evidence that, this change in direction would please some economists, but let's not forget, the economists have been wrong in the past, haven't they?
Well, definitely, I'd agree with that, and our work at Positive Money is definitely trying to hold economists and politicians to account. Look, I think the bigger question here is, what do we want the future of the UK economy to look like? To date, we've depended on this oversized, bloated financial sector and essentially a property bubble to kind of keep the economy going and trickle some trickling down into the economy. We've had policies like the Bank of England actually creating money out of nothing, £445 billion through QE to try and get the economy going. All it's done is made the rich richer by flooding stock markets. We've had the government following fiscal austerity where it's cut back, and we've had 7 years of wages falling and private debt getting higher. And don't forget, the Bank of England has said this week that the biggest risk of financial stability is high private debt. So we're looking towards a high debt, low wage economy. I think that we all need to kind of wake up and have a conversation with ourselves. If we want to turn this economy around, if we want the UK economy to work for most people, then we need to actually change things quite drastically, and we need to start with stopping ideologically cutting public sector pay for absolutely no reason.
Well, given all of that, Fran, you must have been very interested to see this conveyor belt of cabinet ministers coming forward and suggesting that now is the time to look again at that public sector pay cap. I mean, how much of that do you think is to do with some Damascene conversion on their part? How much to do with just the naked politics of a party which has a very, very slender majority?
Well, I think it's obviously a bit of both, and it just kind of shows how empty these phrases we've heard coming out of the Conservatives for the last few years are. Osborne's long-term economic plan, Theresa May's strong and stable. With Brexit, we can see that there was actually no meaning behind those statements because they don't have a long-term plan for this economy. The data this week from the GDP figures was that the UK's savings ratio is at its lowest since records began. We are relying on people getting into more debt in order to keep this economy going. And I think most people in this country are pretty much fed up of it and they want a pay rise. And that is a symptom of a bigger problem around how our economy works. And we need some serious leadership if we're going to turn it around in the next couple of decades.
Alex, just a final word from you. I mean, despite the efforts of your organisation, if you look at the list of people that have come out and talked today, Justine Greening, Jeremy Hunt, Michael Gove, it would appear that if Theresa May wants to stay in number 10, austerity as we know it is about to come to an end.
Well, austerity is going to be around whether or not the politicians like it. Eventually, we're going to have to pay back these vast sums of money that we're borrowing. But with pay, I do think there is, in the public sector, I do think there is a case for some pay increases in some areas. But the problem we have is we have national pay bargaining, and all of this is decided centrally, and what that leads to is people in sort of poorer parts of the UK, places like the North East and the South West, being relatively overpaid, and public sector workers in places like London being relatively underpaid. And this is actually very bad for things like NHS trusts, who do struggle to recruit nurses and then have to buy in agency workers who are even more expensive. It's very bad for HR planning, and it's very bad for health outcomes. But the other thing that we need to look at when we talk about pay is we really do need to look at the whole package here, and particularly pensions, because public sector pensions are vastly more generous than private sector pensions, even after the sort of relatively modest reforms that we had 5 or 6 years ago. If you were to try and replicate an NHS pension in the private sector, you'd need to be putting away about 45% of your gross salary. That's just completely unrealistic for most people working in the private sector. So we can't just look at pay. We've really got to look at the way in which pay bargaining is done, and also look at the pensions and all of the other perks. I mean, job security is far, far greater in the public sector. They get more holiday, they take more sick leave. So we've really got to look at the whole package rather than just sort of headline salaries and percentages. And also, I mean, the public sector isn't just nurses and police, ambulance, etc. You know, there's 350,000 bureaucrats working in the civil service. I mean, do we think that all of them should get a pay rise as well? So I really think a little bit more even-handed approach to this is required.
I think there are 350,000 civil servants who would probably argue that instead. Alex,
sure
Alex Wilde from the Taxpayers Alliance, Fran Boyd, Executive Director at Positive Money. Many thanks to both of you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Sky News at 4, the top stories. Theresa May under renewed pressure from senior Conservatives to scrap the public sector pay cap. Fishing deal cast away, the UK pulls out of an international agreement allowing other countries to trawl our waters. Illegal subletters will not face prosecution if they help identify Grenfell Tower victims. France's president calls on African leaders to join forces to take on terrorists, thugs and murderers. Time to turn back on the taps, calls for drinking fountains across the country to spurt back into life.
Britain's Andy Murray and Johanna Konta say they will play at Wimbledon despite minor injuries. And Sean O'Brien is cleared to play in the Lions' deciding Test match against the All Blacks next weekend.
Good afternoon to you. Theresa May is coming under increasing pressure from within her own party to ease the government's austerity measures and lift the public sector pay cap. Environment Secretary Michael Gove is the latest cabinet member to urge the Prime Minister to reconsider, saying the government should listen to independent bodies that review pay and accept their findings.
These pay review bodies have been set up in order to ensure that we can have authoritative advice on what's required in order to ensure that the public services on which we rely are effectively staffed and the people within them are effectively supported. I think we should respect the integrity of that process. I'm not an individual. I am a member of the government and a member of a collective team, and the collective view of government policy, which helpfully was endorsed by the Labour Party spokesman John earlier, is that we should respect the integrity of the process.
Well, earlier on, Alex Kenny, an executive member of the National Union of Teachers, told Sky News that young teachers in particular are being affected.
The real issue is the way it's affecting younger teachers coming into the job and younger teachers who find they can't stay in the job. I know of young teachers that I work with, some of whom have got second jobs, others have had to move back home with their parents because they are trying to save for a house. So it's time for the government to listen to what teachers are saying, and not just to call us heroes, not just to praise us for the work we do, but to put the money where those words are.
Well, we're joined now by the Conservative MP and former NHS nurse Maria Caulfield from her constituency in Lewis. I have to say, it looks absolutely beautiful there this afternoon. First question for you, you've worked in the public sector yourself. Do you think it's time now for a pay sector rise?
Yeah, no, I absolutely do, and I raised this in my speech in the debate this week in Parliament, because we've had 7 years of a pay freeze, and particularly in nursing, which is my background, there's no real definite end in sight, and so people were prepared to put up with that for a little while, but actually 7 years into it, nurses are starting to struggle, and I think that's why we're starting to see large numbers of vacancies in the professions, because people need to be able to eat, to be able to pay their bills, look after their growing families. And it's getting increasingly harder. So I think a pay freeze coming to an end, I think, has to be inevitable.
And Theresa May, she's under a lot of pressure, but do you think she's going to bow to that?
Well, I think there seems to be a feeling amongst colleagues that this is being looked at seriously now. Obviously, we do need to look at the independent pay review body recommendations and look at those. But for me, in nursing in particular, it isn't just about the pay cap. For me, I was getting increasingly frustrated as a nurse that our pay structure wasn't right. It cannot be right that a nurse in the NHS earns on average about £26,000 a year when every shift nurses are making life and death decisions. But an NHS manager, for example, will earn on average £45,000 a year, and a senior manager £75,000 a year. So for me, it's more than just about the pay freeze. It's also about the pay structure. If we are serious about rewarding nurses, we need to reward them with pay as well.
So why did you vote against Labour's amendment?
Well, see, there is some confusion over this. So the Labour amendment was about amending the Queen's speech, which was really the agenda for the next 2 years for this government. The pay review is already on the agenda. You know, it's likely to be voted on in the budget, and Labour knew this. They weren't really interested in ending a pay freeze for public sector workers. They wanted to bring down the government and for the Queen's speech to fail. So people, you know, obviously have heard that the pay freeze was in the votes this week. Actually, the vote, if we all voted in favour of that last week, the pay freeze would not be lifted and the cap would not have been lifted. So that was about Labour trying to bring down the government. We're serious about trying to address public sector workers' pay, and that will be addressed most likely in the budget, and the work that's being done now is really important to inform those decisions going forward.
And how about funding for schools? Because I've heard lots of them say that they believe funding is in crisis. Surely more money has to be put in there.
Well, certainly here in East Sussex, we've been underfunded from our schools for decades because we're seen as a rural authority. So we've never been well funded compared to urban authorities like next door in Brighton and Hove or in London. And so I've been campaigning for quite a while, since becoming an MP in 2015, to address the school fundings issue. The government, to be fair, have put record levels of funding into education, but because the pupil numbers are growing, that's going being used more sparsely time and time again. So it's not that the money isn't going in, but the per pupil funding needs to be addressed. And certainly, again, when I've met with the Secretary of State, we've heard positive moves on that. And I think that she is making representation to Treasury to say, you know, I've got great schools, I've got good and outstanding schools in my constituency, but teachers need the funding to make that continue. So, you know, I certainly am supporting my local schools and the funding issues that they are facing.
OK, very quick question for you. It's been nearly a month now since that snap election. Can Theresa May hang on, or do you think it's time for a new leader of the Conservative Party?
No, I think she absolutely can hang on. I think, you know, we only saw at Prime Minister's questions last week. She did a fantastic job in standing up for the country. And I think, you know, she's got a tough job to do with Brexit negotiations going forward. So for me, it's really crucial that she stays there and gets the job done.
OK, Maria Caulfield, thank you very much for your time this afternoon.
There's growing pressure on the Prime Minister and the Chancellor over public sector pay rises after another Cabinet Minister raised the prospect of the current 1% cap being lifted. The Environment Secretary Michael Gove said the recommendations of public sector pay bodies which review pay increases should be respected. One of those bodies has warned that the present cap is putting pressure on the health service. Here's our political correspondent Ian Watson.
For every year that there's been a pay freeze or a public sector pay cap, first under a coalition government, then under the Conservatives, there's been a demonstration. But since the government lost its majority, protesters have become more hopeful. Not one day more was the slogan this weekend as they marched to Parliament Square. And there are signs that some in government are listening. Today, the Environment Secretary said that ministers should accept recommendations on pay from independent review bodies.
I think that we should listen to the pay review bodies who govern each individual area of public sector pay. These pay review bodies have been set up in order to ensure that we can have authoritative advice on what's required in order to ensure that the public services on which we rely are effectively staffed and the people within them are effectively supported.
Around 5 million public sector workers have had effectively a 1% cap on pay rises since 2013. This is set to last until the end of the decade, meaning that by 2020, average public sector pay would be no higher in real terms than it was back in 2005. There are 8 independent pay review bodies which make recommendations covering teachers, police and NHS staff, amongst others. They can call for increases above 1%, but the government isn't bound by their recommendations. Decisions on police pay and teachers' pay are expected to be taken later this month. Theresa May's cabinet is split over the principle of whether to lift the public sector pay cap, but it could be dismantled bit by bit. It's widely expected that some of the pay review bodies will recommend increases above 1%. And a government minister close to the process has told me the government is prepared to accept those recommendations. But not everyone in government's convinced a pay cap should be eroded.
It's very important that we keep budget discipline because it's impossible to pay for our public services without having a growing economy. What we have done on public sector pay, actually by having that cap in place, we have saved around 200,000 public sector jobs.
Lifting the public service pay cap entirely could cost around £6 billion, but a former nurse who's now a Conservative MP says the government could pay an even higher price if it keeps it in place.
I know of colleagues who have left nursing. I know people who are taking early retirement, for example, because it's a tough job and long hours, and they can get other jobs with less hours, less responsibility for similar pay. So, you know, we've got to look at the pay structure across the public service.
And Labour said they'd simply scrap the cap entirely.
We're saying to the pay review bodies, get rid of the 1% cap and give a fair pay rise. Well, I think they should consider giving people a pay rise in line with earnings.
These demonstrators haven't succeeded in ending austerity, but they might give 2 cheers if the government eases the cap on public sector pay. Ian Watson, BBC News.
Theresa May is coming under mounting pressure to scrap the 1% cap on public sector pay. But the lobbying isn't just coming from the official opposition and anti-austerity campaigners, but from within her own government. Today, the new Environment Secretary, Michael Gove, hinted that some sort of easing of pay restraint was on the way, saying the government should respect the integrity of the independent pay review bodies, which set wage levels for 5 million public sector workers. Kamian Zeram reports.
Running the country as a minority government, and choose your metaphor. The Limbo Act, the contortionist, or somewhat hopefully, the well-drilled choir. Theresa May is facing more or less an open revolt from within her own cabinet over austerity. After the election disaster, her approval ratings are plummeting, with calls to start a national debate around ending student tuition fees and lifting the public sector pay cap. The independent body advising on NHS wages, warning earlier this year the next generation of staff is harder and harder to find. Keeping pay rises to less than 1%, it said, just isn't sustainable. Even Michael Gove, back in the limelight, sees change on the horizon.
I think that we should listen to the pay review bodies who govern each individual area of public sector pay. These pay review bodies have been set up in order to ensure that we can have authoritative advice on what's required in order to ensure that the public services on which we rely are effectively staffed and the people within them are effectively supported.
It appears to be a rather different tone.
Governing, though, is seldom the sweetest of harmonies, and the political challenges of austerity are no exception. Improving public sector pay and helping students out will cost. It'll cost a lot. Not exactly what the Tories campaigned on.
Well, they're clearly nervous, because it's not just a pay rise. In the newspapers today, they're talking about getting rid of tuition fees. There's the Education Secretary is talking about another $1 billion for schools. They're clearly in chaos.
Is the public mood on public finance changing? There were thousands on the anti-austerity march yesterday, but the government says don't forget what they've already done for the less well-off.
We have given particularly lower paid public sector workers a big break over the last 7 years by raising the personal allowance, so the amount that you can earn tax-free has gone from $6,500 to $11,500, and the very lower paid public sector workers through the minimum wage, which we've increased from £5.93 an hour to £7.50 an hour under the national living wage.
But austerity and the mood music that surrounds it. This is a government having to read from a new script.
Well, earlier I caught up with the Conservative MP Heidi Allen, and I asked her whether she thought it was time for austerity to end.
I mean, austerity is a huge word, isn't it? I mean, it's about, in any government, it's choices, isn't it? What do you choose to spend your money on? And I think the message we received loud and clear, and it wasn't a surprise to me and many of my colleagues, was that perhaps we've got our balance a little bit wrong. I'm disappointed, for example, that the triple lock on pensions, which costs us about $6 billion a year, that was very swiftly dumped. I thought it was a brave policy and one we should have looked at, which would have given us the freedom to look at the pay cap, for example, which I think we need to do.
You mean it's being kept now?
Yes.
There was a U-turn on it.
That's right, and I think, you know, whoever I explained the policy to and why it was a good idea, to a man and a woman, they said, well, actually, no, that's sensible. If my pension's increasing with inflation or cost of living or wage rise levels, then, OK, I don't need that 2.5% top lock, and that costs $6 billion a year. I would rather we found that money to put into school funding or into pay increases for nurses. And I think that dialogue is now well and truly open and good, but we just need to make sure that we are spending money on the right things.
The Chancellor has reportedly asked, though, which taxpayers you want to alienate by putting up taxes. What's your answer to that?
I think some of us are already encouraging them to look at that, whether it's a small increase, particularly on higher earners. But again, it's about making those choices. For me, HS2, I don't think now is the right time. That's a big pot of money, and that triple lock. I think if we can be sensible, then we don't need to look at huge tax rises, something very, very modest, but also a rebalancing of where we're spending our money.
So 50p rate of tax for the very highest earners?
I wouldn't want to see us go to that level, because at the end of the day, quite often it's those people that are generating the jobs, and if we stop generating jobs, then the whole economic wheel stops turning.
Well, that means going down a level and increasing taxes for people earning, say, £80,000. Would you be up for doing that?
Yeah, possibly, and a modest increase, perhaps 1%, particularly if you can show to the public that you're ring-fencing it for the NHS and social care. Certainly on the doorstep in the election, I found people very persuaded by that argument.
Of course, the government managed to find an extra £1 billion, some have called it a bung, for the DUP. And that's opened the floodgates for your colleagues in government to demand extra money. Was that a good deal, or was it pork barrel politics?
Well, it certainly opened the conversation, and I was very critical of that deal because I didn't feel we needed to do it. I feel confident we would have had the DUP supporting the crucial voting lobbies regardless. But of course it asks the question, well, if $1 billion is available, then can we look at other things? There's no question, of course, that the people of Northern Ireland will benefit greatly from that, but for me it wasn't the right way to prioritise spending.
The Grenfell tragedy is still having massive reverberation several weeks on. What do you make of the suggestion that the government should use its powers to send commissioners in and basically take over running the council?
Well, if that's what it needs to give the residents some sense of ownership and that people are going to take control of the situation, because they're feeling understandably very, very worried and wounded at the moment. So if that's what will help them, then perhaps that is the right answer.
The extraordinary gulf between the people living there and the people who are supposed to represent them is really exemplified by the fact that some Grenfell survivors are still having their rent taken out. What do you make of that?
Yeah, that's desperate. I read about that myself in the newspaper this morning. This is the problem with any government organisation or public sector body. It's a machine, and unfortunately that machine still keeps turning when people's lives are desperately affected. And I know that the people responsible for that have already apologised and said, of course, the money will be returned. But this is where the detail really matters, because people are very, very upset at the moment, and we need to get that detail right for them.
Heidi Allen speaking to me earlier.
Well, I'm joined now by Julia Hartley-Brewer and Susie Boniface. Good to see the both of you again. Let's go straight to this story, which is on the front page of The Guardian. It's about Brexit. So it's got the headline, UK ditches its cake and eat it, Brexit stance.
Well, it's ostensibly about Brexit, but there are a bunch of newspapers tomorrow which are basically, they've got front pages that are about Theresa May, and they're all posing one question, which is there anything this woman can do right? Guardian's got Brexit. We've got here is saying, fundamentally, the story is saying the whole idea of having as much access as we want to the EU and having as much control as we want over ourselves are two opposing things. You've got to have either lots of access and less control, or more control and less access.
I love that
there's an argument about this.
I think this is what we voted on last
Well,
year.
exactly. This is the kind of thing people were supposed to be arguing about during the referendum. But this is fundamentally saying, look, that the cabinet is split, and we're having these discussions now in open. We're having them in public. The Prime Minister is not able to control her executive team. The cabinet is supposed to have collective responsibility. As Michael Gove said today, they're not individuals. They're supposed to follow the party line, do as the Prime Minister says, and go out and enforce the Cabinet's and the government's policies, and to explain them to the public and to push them through their own departments. And what we've got here, newspaper after newspaper after newspaper, is signs that the Cabinet is totally split on just about every issue.
But the thing is, we did know. I mean, on this particular issue of Brexit, we knew they were. We knew there were Remainers and Leavers. I mean, with all due respect to the Brexit policy editor of The Guardian, Dan Roberts, but I mean, this dramatic change of mood as ministers urged to accept compromise. Yeah, the officials who are all, complete signed-up Remainers dealing with the EU, all obviously all think it's insane that anyone should want national sovereignty and democracy, and never accepted the democratic outcome of a referendum ever in the EU previous to this. Of course, this is what they're saying, but I mean, the reality is every British voter on June the 23rd last year knew this was the choice. There's going to be a trade-off on these things.
But
there's simply no change.
What's telling about this front page is that the official policy stance is we can have access and we can can have control. And there is the acceptance now
Well,
that
like
you can't
every
have
other
both.
country that doesn't
But
trade
the
deal.
Prime Minister's policy is being fundamentally undermined.
Yeah,
and it's the
I
same
agree with
thing
that.
in the other papers. We've got here we've got the Sun saying doomsday, when she's got to stay until the end of Brexit in order to strengthen our hand. But in the meantime, for the next 2 years, every time something goes wrong, she's going to have all her cabinet arguing with her, number one, arguing with each other.
Which senior cabinet official is going to want the Prime Minister's job at this moment in time?
None of them. They want her to have her job so that every time something goes wrong, they can dump it on her. Sorry.
They want her to soak up all of the bad things, and all the bad stuff related to Brexit as well. Yes, even as a Brexiteer, I'll admit there'll be things that don't go our way, but they want her to soak it all up, and then they ride in and they save the day, and they come in as this fresh face. I mean, again, such as someone like David Davis is going to be fresh face.
Do you give the Prime Minister until 2019, or
do you know, could you put up with that for 2 years, being blamed for everything that goes wrong around you that you can't possibly?
To be fair to her, in her defence, and there's not much to say in her defence at the moment, she has been stoic. Beyond to a scary
the opposite
extent.
of David Cameron.
Tati-tati-tom back. I'm resigning.
Yeah.
Tati-tati-tom back into number 10. She has been stoic beyond belief since this debacle of the election result.
Including she feels she has a duty to govern.
Yeah, there does seem to be a bit of that, and she's just going to stick on. And again, she's got nothing to lose really, because at least she could try and get some semblance back of respect for her.
Yeah, but if she's going to have 2 years of being blamed for everything that goes wrong, and as you were saying before we came on, she's had a terrible time that's not to do with her in terms of the terror attacks, in terms of
I genuinely think any leader of any
Brexit.
political party, I mean, even the likes of Tony Blair and David Cameron, who were just...
They could struggled with that kind of stuff on their plate.
The combination, dealing with Brexit alone, we have a divided nation on this massive, massive issue, dealing with the terror, that string of terror attacks and the Grenfell Tower, and not just the Grenfell Tower disaster, but the revelation that basically every tower block in Britain could go up in flames at a moment's notice. I mean, I think that is a range of crises that anyone would struggle with.
And talking about the pressures on the Prime Minister, I mean, this will be an added pressure. This headline was on the front page of the Metro.
Not Cara's.
Not that one,
Very
yeah.
nice, I'm sure.
Oops, no.
This headline, nurses quit NHS in their thousands.
Yeah, they're now
morale is
more-
extremely low, according to its
There are
reports.
more leaving than there are actually joining the profession. It's adding to this argument about austerity having to be over. Now, in the general election campaign we just had, Theresa May dumped all over austerity. She dumped all over David Cameron's legacy, such as it was. Said she sacked all his advisors the moment she took office, and said we don't need any of this anymore. Now we've got various members of the cabinet. Some of them are saying we need to end austerity. Some of them are saying we need tax rises. Some of them are saying we can't have tax rises.
This would have been going on inside a Cameron cabinet as well.
Yes, but it goes on inside, and that's where she's lost her authority and her control, and that means we're now having all this chaos on the outside, where it just destabilises everybody.
Or you could call it modern democratic debate, and there is a debate to be had here. And again, this is one of the issues. There are so many ongoing issues here in terms of the cutting of the pay and the austerity. I mean, cutting the pay in real terms, no question, 40% pay cut over 7 years for nurses. And the simple fact of the matter is, we know they're not being paid enough because they are leaving, and it's difficult to even get people from abroad. But again, one of the biggest issues is this ridiculous decision made by the coalition government in 2010 to cut the number of people who could train to be nurses in this country. And then they went, we haven't got enough people who are nurses. We'll have to import some people from abroad. How will the NHS cope without them? We have thousands of people who would like to be nurses if they could afford to be nurses in this country, who want to train, and we've not been letting them train.
This is a story on the front page of the Times. Back to the Prime Minister once again. It says the terror plans are condemned.
Yeah, this is her plan for basically taking on all the big technology companies, and the idea that she wants to start fining them if they don't take down extremist material online. And that's both looking for it and identifying, and when it's identified, taking it down. And we've had quite a few investigations now that have proven they just simply don't even bother doing it down. But it's interesting that Max Hill QC, who is her own counter-terrorism watchdog, said this is going to basically, when you criminalise Google and Facebook, you're basically taking them off your side. But you know what? I think this is a load of nonsense, because these companies are not cooperating. And as we were discussing the last paper review earlier on this evening, they only act when it's about money. Everything in terms of Facebook, nothing is going to happen unless we know that Zuckerberg is definitely going to be going for that US presidential slot, which we're pretty sure he's going to be running for. He's only cleaning up Facebook. Now he needs to have a public...
So what will it take these big companies to... I mean, how much pressure, what type of pressure would you have to put on these companies in order for them to change
Money,
this?
advertisers. It's all about advertising.
If you cast your mind back to, I think it was 2011, the phone hacking scandal, what changed things there probably was the fact that as the scandal grew, advertisers started withdrawing adverts from the News of the World, and that encouraged the decision to actually. It's when YouTube and Google and Facebook find that when those brands as a place to host adverts becomes too toxic, and unfortunately it needs something more than the terror attacks we've had so far, which are fomented online. It needs something even worse, and to link it definitively to something, and that'll probably be the end of it.
But the idea that we have to be nicey to these people and not charge them tax and not tell them off when they do things wrong, rubbish. Especially, I mean, as a parent, forget even the terrorism stuff. For me, it's the absolute refusal to take down the stuff that's quite clean for people.
It's Theresa May not being able to understand quite how the internet works. Her own counter-terrorism watchdog saying what she's suggesting isn't working. And here we've got a story how in the 2 weeks or so she was struggling to get a deal with the DUP, she was reduced to calling up David Cameron and saying, please could you help and give us some support. And it says here this caused embarrassment on both sides.
That's such a bad thing, though.
I think it's bad that it's come out. I think this is the sort of stuff that should never come out. Either he's leaked it or
David Cameron's leaked it.
But that's tacky. Yeah. Because actually, I mean, in America, past presidents have a very close relationship. Well, normally, I don't think Donald Trump does with current presidents. The only people who've been in that position, and then we actually know from memoirs and things that the likes John Major and Tony Blair have actually carried on good relations with subsequent prime ministers. And I think it's tacky that this has come out.
In the months since she's taken over, Theresa May has not reached out to David Cameron. It says in this article, she's dumped a lot of his legacy and his aides as soon as she took into Downing Street. What was his legacy? Well, such as it was. And then she's rung him up and said, please could you help convince people to support this DUP deal, which is getting lots of bad ideas. And he said, which is the most damning thing he possibly done. He's understood to have offered to tweet approvingly about it. Goodness. That must have hurt. And he sent a tweet on.
It's a beleaguered Prime Minister.
25th of June.
But that's the thing. She's now in the position where it's like Diane Abbott when she makes a gaffe. There are lots of people who can get numbers wrong and make a gaffe, and it's just seen as well. Everyone has a bad day, or everyone just as a slip of the tongue. When it's Diane Abbott and it's numbers, then
when it becomes the narrative,
and when it's Theresa May, every single thing that she touches is she's turning to.
When the narrative is this Prime Minister can't do the job, she's inept, then that is something that the people around her capitalise on, and that's
it becomes very hard to shake off.